How's it going, everybody? CJ here, back with another video. We're doing a first thoughts. This one's on Rendmaw Creaking Nest. This card is awesome, super flavorful. It's just a giant scarecrow that's scaring the birds and goading all the birds, and everybody gets birds, and there's a lot of really cool synergies with this deck. I think that this is going to be a very fun commander and a very unique Golgari deck. There's some interesting cards I want to talk about here. The first category of cards I want to mention are cards that synergize well with the fact that you're giving everybody birds. So let's start off with those. First of all, the birds are 2/2 flying black creatures. So cards like Compost and Reap would work very well in this deck. You can use Insidious Roots to turn your birds into mana dorks. Idol of Oblivion is card draw whenever you make a bird. Culling Ritual is a good way to make a ton of mana by blowing up all the birds. In a similar vein, Tegwill's Scouring becomes an instant speed board wipe by tapping some of your birds. Bloodseeker is a good way to continue to drain your opponents out. Species Specialist, you name birds. Whenever a bird dies, you're going to draw a card. Perfect. Massacre Worm could end up just killing all of your opponents, giving everything -2/-2 until end of turn. All the birds dying, and then each of those players losing 2 life per bird. Toski and Oran Frostfang are good card draw engines. There are some curses that would work well in this deck, like Curse of Predation and Curse of Disturbance. Crown of Doom seems like a lot of fun, making your opponent pass this thing around, and they'll be taking more damage. Calculating Lich is another way to make it so your opponents lose additional life. Primal Vigor is absolutely perfect for this deck because it's going to make it so everybody gets double bird tokens. I like Signal Pest in here because it'll make your birds deal more damage while also triggering Rendmaw because it's an artifact creature. Same thing with Metallic Mimic. It's an artifact creature that will trigger Rendmaw and also make it so all your birds enter with a +1/+1 counter. Moving on, there's a few one-off cards I want to mention, just because these cards didn't fit any other categories I'll be talking about today. However, they seem really good in the deck and they provide a lot of good synergies. Genesis Chamber, Barika, and Grismold all make your opponent's additional tokens, which will fit the theme of this deck and do what this deck's trying to do. Plus, Barika is an enchantment creature, so it'll trigger Rendmaw. Bad Moon to make it so all of the birds get +1/+1, so they're dealing more damage. But if you want to make those birds deal real damage, throw in a Coat of Arms. Now the birds are huge. Since they're enter tapped and are goaded, these birds are going to be getting in damage. Coat of Arms is going to kill people quickly. Essence Warden can be good to pad your life total. Basically, whenever you cast a multi-type spell, you're going to gain 4 life. Additionally, you can use Roaming Throne to double up those tokens. And Babala Saga is a really cool engine in this deck because you're already playing the type of deck Babala Saga would want to be the helm of. Decks with a lot of multi-typed permanents, this seems perfect. Speaking of multi-type permanents, let's talk about those. I went through and I compiled a list of cards that I think would be worth running in the deck that are multi-type permanents to trigger Rendmaw, but also just either synergistic in the deck or just good cards that I think would work well. Starting off, we have cards that are lands, but also something else in addition to being a land, because Rendmaw triggers when you play a multi-type card. So Dryad Arbor will trigger Rendmaw. Same thing with Urza's Saga, Valgavoth Slayer, Vault of Whispers, Tree of Tales, Treasure Vault, Scene of the Crime, Power Depot, Darksteel Citadel, and Dark Moss Bridge. Next, we have a handful of enchantment creatures, because enchantment creatures are going to be good in here. Springheart Nantuko can generate a bunch of tokens. Renata can make your birds bigger and all your creatures bigger. Overlord of the Hauntwoods seems really cool. Nylea Keen-Eyed can be awesome in here. I recommend building this deck with a very heavy creature skew and going like artifact creatures and or enchantment creatures, so that way you can trigger Rendmaw whenever you play one of them. And it's a card type that just shows up on a lot of different cards. It's harder to find like enchantment artifacts and stuff like that. Creatures, generally the most easy creature type to find with multiple typings. Dockside Chef, you can use it to also sacrifice your birds. Enduring Vitality can turn all your creatures into mana dorks, which if you're going that route of having a lot of creatures in your deck can help a lot. Dryad of the Elysian Grove to fix your mana and let you play additional lands. Destiny Spinner seems great, especially if you play against a lot of blue decks. Corsair Crew Fix is nice, Arasta of the Endless Web, and Archetype of Endurance. There are 2 enchantment artifacts that I think are worth running in the deck, or at least worth considering. You have Bow Annihilia, which can put counters on things to make your birds bigger, and it can also kill birds, which is interesting. Along with Whip of Erebos, giving all your creatures lifelink can really pad your life total, and you can use it to bring back some things you didn't want to lose. And now for artifact creatures. There's a lot of good artifact creatures for this deck. Twitching Doll is a mana dork that can also generate a bunch of tokens. Great for the deck. You also have Ornithopter of Paradise, Plague Mirror, Mannequin, Leaden Mirror, and Copper Mirror for additional mana dorks that are also artifacts, so you're triggering Rendmaw with your ramp. Perfect. Rug of Smothering seems really good for this deck because your opponents are already going to have a pretty pressured life total, and this helps to shorten that clock. Noxious Gearhulk, Necron Deathmark, and Duplicant are all removal that are artifact creatures. Another piece of removal is Haywire Might, which is artifact or enchantment removal. And you have Canoptic Scarab Swarm, which can generate a bunch of tokens for you while also being graveyard hate. And lastly, let's talk about some of the tribal cards, because tribal is a type that counts towards Rendmaw. So Lignify is a tribal enchantment. That means it'll trigger Rendmaw and be a great removal card. There's also Eyeblight's Ending, Cloak and Dagger, which is nice because you can give Shroud to Rendmaw on an equipment that'll trigger it, and Bitter Blossom, another token generator that makes flyers. If you didn't notice, most of the cards I mentioned there, outside of being creatures, were also either artifacts or enchantments. You can go with a blend of both artifact and enchantment creatures, which is good, or you can try to lean into one or the other, which lets you play some additional synergy pieces. If you went with artifacts as your main line you're going to go down, being artifact creatures, you could toss in Steel Overseer to grow your board. Scorpek Lord, very cool in the deck. Mycosynth Golem can let you start casting things for free. Metalworker would be an amazing mana dork in this deck. Lodestone Golem to tax your opponents a little bit. Liberator, great card. Karn Legacy Reforged can make a ton of mana. Foundry Inspector can reduce the cost of your artifacts. Cyberman Squadron could be super fun in this deck. Cyberman Patrol, same thing. Awesome for this deck. Really like that one. And then you have both Mycosynth Lattice and Biotransference. Mycosynth Lattice makes it so everything's an artifact. So if you play a land, it's also an artifact no matter what. So you're going to trigger Rendmaw. Awesome. Biotransference only works with creatures. However, it'll turn all of your creatures into artifacts, making it so even your non-artifact creatures will trigger Rendmaw, along with generating a bunch of tokens. There's not just a lot of good artifact synergies that work in this deck, but there's also a lot of good enchantment synergies. So if you wanted to lean heavier into enchantments, you have options like Weaver of Harmony to grow your enchantment creatures and copy some triggers. Sanctum Weaver can generate a lot of mana. Eidolon of Blossoms and other cards that whenever you play an enchantment draw card seem fantastic. Doomwake Giant, it's kind of anti-synergistic if you're killing all the birds, but it can stop your opponents from having a board state at all. Demon of Fate's Design is kind of interesting here, and Ephemia. Because of the way this deck works, where you want to have multi-typed cards, you're gonna have a lot of multi-typed cards. You're gonna want to have as many as possible, and creature is just the easiest type to overlap with. So if you end up with a deck that's all creatures, you could run Umori as a partner, which I love for this deck, making it so all of your creature spells, which would be all of your spells, cost one less to cast. If you go that route, Ancient Cellar Spawn would be a perfect include in here. It's an enchantment creature, and it'll make it so your opponents lose life whenever you cast a creature. Greater Tanuki would work well in here as an additional way to ramp while not really being a creature, but it is a creature. And you have Shigeki, another channel creature where it's essentially a spell if you channel it, but it's a creature otherwise. And they're both enchantment creatures, which would trigger Rendmaw. Another way you could build this deck is to be kind of like a storm deck, where your whole goal is to make as many birds as possible as fast as possible, so your opponents have to kill each other. However, I don't think this is a great storm commander, but it could make for an interesting build. I only wanted to mention a couple of cards as examples. You have Memnite, Ornithopter, Phyrexian Walker, and Shield Sphere as artifact creatures that are 0 mana. So you can just drop these and then make dudes, and the dudes have to swing. It seems fine. There's definitely some ways you can go about building it this route, but I didn't want to talk too much about it just because I don't think it's the best build. I don't think it's the most fun build. And moving on to the last category I want to talk about. A lot of people have tried to build Scarecrow decks. Scarecrow decks are cool. However, previously the best Scarecrow commander was Reaper King, and that is not a fun Scarecrow to play against. Rendmaw provides a much more fun to play against Scarecrow commander that works really well with Scarecrows. So why not run a Scarecrow deck with Rendmaw? Some of the good Scarecrows you can include are Fang Skulkin, Wildfield Scarecrow, Wicker Picker, Wickerfolk Thresher, the Swarm Weaver, Shire Scarecrow, Scuttlemutt, which is a mana dork, which is pretty nice, Scorn Effigy, Scaretiller, Pilipala, Scarecrone, which I love for this deck. It would be a auto include, perfect if you're going Scarecrows. Honestly, very good if you're going anything that involves artifact creatures. Osseous Stick Twister, Heap Doll, Grim Poppet, Farmstead Gleaner, and Geist Fueled Scarecrow. And since you're already going to be running cards like Farmstead Gleaner or Pilipala, you could also toss in Marvin to have a little infinite combo in there. Palladium Mirror is a mana dork that's also an artifact creature and will trigger Rendmaw but taps for 2 colorless. Perfect. So you could have Marvin with the Palladium Mirror in play, and then your choice of Farmstead Gleaner or Pilipala, which would make it so Marvin can now tap for 2 colorless with the Palladium Mirror, and then untap it with, let's say, Pilipala to make 1 colored mana, and you make infinite mana. And you can swap out Pilipala with Farmstead Gleaner to make an infinitely large Marvin. Just seems like a cool deck that you could toss the Marvin in because he is an artifact creature that would trigger Rendmaw anyways and may have some other synergies in the deck. That is everything I have for Rendmaw Creaking Nest. Let me know if you plan on building this deck, and I'll see you next time. Peace out, everybody.